so peaceful, and thanks so much for joining me. In this video today I'm going to show you how to make a little storage basket, ideal for your tools, and it's got applique flower on both sides. We do have kits available in our store at the moment using the red tilde or the purple and coordinating fabrics, but I'm sure if you'd like to follow along and use your own fabrics and supplies, you'll be able to do that. If you've used the Hugs and Kisses applique paper before, or you've watched other videos, you might find there'll be a repeat in this first part of the video, but follow along, you might hear something new or select the bits that you'd like to learn a little bit more about. In part 2 of this video, I'll show you how to actually sew up the basket. So if that sounds like something that's of interest to you, please stick around and I'll get started. So if you purchase a kit, what you'll find is that you've got all the fabric that you'll need. We have a plain linen fabric for one side, and then you'll have a check or a stripe fabric for the back. And as I mentioned, this one on the table is purple, and we also have the red option. You'll find fabric that will be for the inside. Now it may be slightly different to the one that I'm using today, but everything is designed to go together. There's also a couple of small strips that will be used for the that will get added onto the lining, and then they get turned to the front, but again that's part 2. And then you'll get a series of smaller pieces, again colours that will coordinate, and this is designed to have one flower and a set of leaves on the linen fabric, and not the same flower as in the same shapes, but you could have a different layout on the stripes. So it's up to you. You will make a decision then which fabrics that you're going to use for your petals, which ones that you're going to use for your leaves. The green fabric that's in your kit will always be the leaves. There'll be something that will be obviously leaves, but the other ones you'll have a larger piece of fabric that's going to be your petals, and a couple of smaller pieces, possibly squares, that we'll use for the circles. So each flower has a large circle and a small circle, and you should be able to work out then which is pieces for your flowers and which is your circles. As I said, the leaves will always be green. So we can pop those pieces of fabric away, and what we're going to be using to start with, the others we won't need for a little while, is just the pieces that we're going to be using for the applique. In your pattern booklet you'll find the design there in the inside page, and there are instructions then. If I just turn that around, you might be able to see it a bit easier, but instructions for how many of each shape you need to trace. So you'll also have a piece of applique paper. When you check out this paper, be aware that there is a shiny side and a flat side or a matte side, and we're going to be tracing onto that flat side. So this shiny side is a little bit slippery. You should be able to feel the difference. So as I've written on the instructions there, for each flower, and there's one side and then another side, so 2 flowers. For each flower then you'll need 1 large circle, 5 petals, 4 or 5 leaves. So this side I've got 4 leaves, and that side I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Again, it's up to you. So you need, I would suggest that if you take at least 10 leaves for both, you'll be right. And then 2 small circles. The reason I use 2 small circles on each flower is if you make that the paper for the small circle double the thickness, so there are actually 2 pieces of applique paper in there, it will be easier for you to turn the fabric over. I should have mentioned that the Hugs and Kisses paper is semi-water soluble, so once I've washed that, it will soften in the wash and wash it. So tracing the shapes then, and when you trace them, just remember to, they can be as close as you can fit them on your piece of paper, because you only need to be able to cut on the lines that you draw. The other thing that I've got here is a sandpaper board. Now, if you don't have one of those, a piece of sandpaper obviously will do the same trick if you want to raid your toolbox or somebody's toolbox you've got in your house there. And it will just hold that down for you, stop it sliding around on the table, makes it easier to trace. So what we're going to be doing then, and I would start tracing the bigger shapes first to make sure I've got enough room. So if I've got one large circle for each one of my flowers, I'm going to start with 2 large circles, obviously, one for each of my flowers, and I can just get all these shapes traced out. When you are tracing, just try and keep your shapes nice and smooth. When you're cutting, that's probably more important, because if your line's a bit bumpy now, you can certainly try and get a smoother edge on it when you cut it. So we'll have our 2 large circles, and then I'll start on the petals, and then those smaller circles should be able to find space to squeeze them in somewhere on that piece of paper. So at this point then, I've got all my shapes on my, traced onto my piece of applique paper, enough for 2 sets of flowers, and I'll cut them out shortly. As you'll see, there's only a little bit of space left, but by fitting them all together, you might be able to save a little bit more, and you can certainly put that away for another project. Now, I will cut those out, and if you haven't done any cutting before, or you haven't heard this trick, if you hold your scissors in one hand and just move the paper around the scissors like that, keep turning, you'll find that you'll get a much smoother line than if you try to do it any other way. So keep in mind that the shape that you've cut is going to be the one that your fabric will get folded over. So if you've got bumps, too many pointy edges on that shape, you'll probably end up with pointy edges once you've got the fabric on it. So just try and keep that in mind. And, you know, again, we're not going to get a mark out of 10 for that, but you know, it's just something to keep in mind. So I will go through and cut out my shapes shortly, but before I do that, I'm going to suggest to you that you lay out the fabrics that are in your kit, on one on the striped or the check if it's a purple one, or the red one, and then one on the plain piece of linen. Keep in mind the biggest piece is going to be for your flower petals, and then you've got 2 circles. So just lay them out, and you know, you could swap them around, work out which ones are going to work best on the coloured background. I said the fabrics that you get are not going to be identical to these ones, so yours might end up looking you know, a bit differently to mine. But just have a little play and to make sure that you're happy with which flower will go on which background. So once I've got my pieces cut out for my first flower then, and I've decided which one is actually going to be my first flower, and really which one you start with doesn't matter. And to be honest, once you've made that first flower, there's no reason why you can't change your mind about which piece it goes onto. I just find it a bit helpful to at least have an idea. But the other thing that I would do at that point, once I'm settled on something, is to take a photo of it, because once you start getting too far ahead, making your flower, it's easy to get them mixed up and forget what it was that you'd actually planned. So I'm going to start with this one, I think, and that will be my leaves. My pink is for my petals, and I've got 2 pieces here, and you might find in your kit that you've got 2 pieces too, if I was a bit worried that your leaves wouldn't all fit on that fabric. So I can pop the white piece away. This is the one that I'm needing to think about, and I think I'll put the green as a large circle and then that one on top. Other thing that I didn't mention that it's probably important to, so you don't get too confused. On the pattern, you'll notice that petal has got some little dotted lines under there. That is because the petal is actually going to sit underneath the circle. So when we start leaving extra fabric around the shapes, which we'll do shortly, you don't need to worry about that bottom edge, because you're not going to tuck the fabric over that bottom edge, because it will sit underneath the circle. Hope that makes sense. Okay, so what we're going to do now then is take our 5 petals, and when we pop that on the fabric, we need to make sure that there's room, let's say, to be generous, 1/2 inch between them. But as I mentioned, because I don't have to worry about that bottom edge and turning that under, I could simply put that bottom edge on the edge of my fabric. I've just got to make sure that I can cut 1/4 inch of fabric all the way around the outside edge. So, and you can, you know, think about how you want to lay out your fabric, how you want to cut your petals. You might find that you've got, you know, particular flowers on there that you might like to highlight or to use. Give it some thought. My only suggestion is, you know, if you've got, say, 2 that I wanted to use, if I wanted to use the flowers on that piece of paisley, for example, I wouldn't just have one like that. I would make sure I've got a second one, so just to give it a bit of balance. So when you put your petals down, for example, you know, you might have 2 that are one colour from that fabric, and then the 3 that look different, because one on its own would look a bit odd. So just give some thought to how you can do that, if you're wanting to use that. Once I've got my petals on my fabric and I know I've got plenty of room to cut, that's a bit tight probably, to cut 1/4 inch around them, then I will press that down with the iron. Remember, we had that slippery, shiny side on your paper? That slippery or shiny side is the fusible side. So we're going to press these in a moment with the iron. We need to make sure that shiny side is facing downwards onto the fabric, because otherwise it will stick to the iron. And you can ask me how I know later. So I just need to make sure, as I said, that we can cut 1/4 inch around each one of those shapes. And then I'll give it a press with the iron. So that is for the petals. The green, I'm going to, that tealy colour, I'm going to use from my circle, or my big circle. And I'll use some of this fabric from my little circles. And remember, I mentioned to cut out 2 of those small circles. What we're going to do, again, feel the sides, make sure you got it right side down, and I might put that one on that little red flower there. With the second one, and remember I cut out 2 the same, second one, again with the shiny side down, going to just position it on top of the first one to make it double thickness. So if it's easier for you, just press one down first with the iron, and then you know it's not going to move. Grab your second one and put it on top, and then press it down. You do need to make sure they're sort of lined up. Okay, I'll press them with the iron. Now, somewhere between here and the ironing board, which is such a very short distance, I managed to lose one of my petals, so I had to come back and use that tiny little piece that I had left on the paper to cut another one. So I will make sure I give you a little bit bigger piece of paper than the one that I used so that you don't run out. Speaking of ironing, I also mentioned about, getting it stuck to the iron, and if that does happen, please don't panic. It will, if you've ever used Visifix, you know the mess that makes if it sticks to the iron, and this will stick to the iron as well if you have the sticky side facing the iron. But just grab something. Look, I would normally use a pair of scissors, although if you're worried about scratching your iron, something that is silicone perhaps, that you could just peel it off easily. It does come off. Please don't burn your fingers. The other thing, once I've done that, I just use normally a wet wipe or something just to wipe the little bit of glue that's still left on the iron, because otherwise if you try to press it again and you've got the glue on your iron, it will just be picking it up again. So anyway, I've got all those pieces now onto my fabric and enough space to cut around them. As mentioned, because I don't have to leave extra space on the base of the petals, I can line them up on the bottom. Now, what we're looking for is probably 1/4 of an inch, no more than 1/4 of an inch around those shapes. So you'll need to cut them all out, leaving that much room. Because we're going to be using a technique, pinch and gather, to get that fabric around that shape, if you have more than 1/4 of an inch, you'll find it really hard to do that because there's a lot of extra fabric that you've got to gather up. Sometimes if people are really struggling with that, I would say just give it a slightest trim back. You can probably go to 1/8 of an inch, but you still need to make sure that you've got plenty to turn under so that it won't pull out when you stitch it down. So I will cut those out shortly. In fact, with the small circles, for example, 1/4 of an inch is going to be too big, so 1/8 would be a much better way to go. And an 1/4 of an inch is 6 millimeters for those of you who not au fait with inches, but I've made myself some little measuring cards and drew 1/4 of an inch, 2 lines 1/4 of an inch apart, so that it's easy to refer to if you have got no idea. But once you've done a bit of patchwork for a while, you'll be used to that 1/4 of an inch seam allowance, and you'll be able to do it in your sleep. So just following the shapes around, leaving that space. So they'll all need that extra 1/4 of an inch outside your fabric, except for the petals, which will only need it around the outside edge and not along that bottom edge. Once you've got all those done, then you'll start to use the glue stick to glue that down. This particular glue stick is a Soline glue pen, and it's designed for fabric. Now, when you put your glue on, I find it easier just to do a little bit at a time, but just to push that outside fabric over the edge of your paper. Couple of things that you'll need to be careful of because that paper is soft, if you have too much glue, as I mentioned earlier, sorry, it is semi-dissolvable, so if you've got too much glue on it, it will start to dissolve, which reminds me, don't have any water in your iron or no water near it when you're putting your paper onto your fabric. But you want to make sure that you don't buckle that edge of the paper. If you're pushing too hard, it will, put it out of shape. You want to keep that nice shape that you've gone to so much trouble to draw. So just little gather and pinch and gather so it goes nicely around that shape. Now, what you will have noticed, I started doing that on the table, and once you've done a few, you'll find that you can control that without pushing too hard. If you're having trouble and you think you're losing your shape, when you if you pick it up and you hold it in your hand and just pinch it and gather it around, you'll be able to feel that edge much more easily between your thumb and your finger, and it's easier to be a little bit more gentle with it around there like that. So what you're looking for is nice smooth curves on your petals. Keep going until you've got them all done. With your leaves, a little bit different here. And again, just a tiny bit of glue. Try not to get the glue on the fabric, it's just on the inside edge of your paper. But we're going to press one side over first. So I've got a point there. Can you see how I've got that? That side is pressed, tail side is pressed over the fabric on the bottom. And I'm going to go, and I'm right-handed, so I apologise for anybody who's not only watching upside down, but thinking, because it's sort of, I don't know, upside down, inside out, every which way, if you are left-handed. So once again, pinch and gather, little tiny pinch and gather to get around that curve. And as we're coming down to this bottom edge, I've just popped a little bit of glue on that fabric that I'd already pressed over. We're going to be pressing this side of the fabric over the top of the first one. So what you end up with then is a tail that sticks out the bottom. Can you see that little tail there? I hope so. We don't want to cut that off, because when we go to stitch it down onto our background fabric, that tail just gets tucked in underneath, and we'll end up with a nice sharp point on our leaves that way. So have that tail sticking out like that, and to do that you make sure that one side of the fabric is folded down first and the other one is folded over the top into that point. Okay, gluing all your pieces then in the same way, your two circles, your big one and your little one, which is a double thickness circle, and then all your petals, and then we'll start laying it out. So as you can see, I've got my shapes all glued, and I'm reasonably happy with that. Please don't be too hard on yourselves. I mean, it does take a little bit of time to get that nice smooth curve going on, but as I mentioned earlier, the secret is really in not having too much fabric there, just enough, and you will get that right to make it easier for yourself a bit later on. What I have done, nothing is glued, is I've stitched down at the moment, but we're going to stitch these two circles together, and we'll do that because it's easy to stitch the little one to the big one before we have to stitch through the petals as well. So I've actually attached that with a small drop of basting glue. I mean, you could simply hold that and stitch it, or if you had some pins, I think it would be harder to stick a pin in it and stitch it. What we're going to stitch it with, and you'll find that in your kit, is a size 10 applique needle, Hugs and Kisses applique needle, and I've given you some 1 to fill 80 weight thread in your kit. And the secret to making your stitches less visible, I've found, is simply, you know, having the right needle and thread, and it hides your stitches. So when we start to do our blind applique stitch, we're going to come up from the bottom, so our knot will be on the bottom of the fabric, and we're going, as we come up, we're going to come up through the side of the little circle. So we don't want to be coming up through the top of it, but we're going to come out the side of it. So I've got my needle coming out through the side there, and then straight down on the outside beside where I've come up. And then move along probably 1/8 of an inch. I certainly haven't measured it. It's not very far. Wouldn't be as big as 1/4 of an inch for sure, but they're not right on top of each other. There is space between them. So once again, coming up through the side of the little circle and then back down on the outside. Now, when I go on the outside, see, I haven't got it through that little circle, but I do push my needle, so it's going on a bit of an angle underneath that little circle. And that will just, you know, doubly make sure that my stitch isn't coming out on an angle to be seen. So up through the side of my little circle and straight back down on the outside. So if you keep in mind that if your stitches are straight up and straight down, not on a diagonal, they will be less visible. Because they're obviously going to take up a whole lot less space. So up on the inside of your little circle and down on the outside of it with your stitches going around that little circle. Now, because your stitches will be so small and beautiful, it will be hard to see, but when you turn it over onto the back, you'll be able to see where you've gone round, and that's how you'll know when you've gone all the way around. So let's continue to stitch then our little circle to the big one. Once you've got your circle finished stitching then, and again, I've had a little play with my petals, make sure that I'm happy with the order that I've got them in. We have a couple of choices. We could just simply leave them like that, and then with the basting glue, put a few drops around here, make sure it fits on top as such, and then we'll go and applique it onto our background fabric. The way that I've found is a little bit easier to do it is if we turn this circle upside down, and if we keep the order then that we're going to use our petals, we'll pop them just inside the edge of the circle, so they will meet up like that. But you'll be able to see, and you'll be able to move them, make sure you've got similar space in between, but you'll be able to make sure that they're actually well covered by the circle then. Once I'm happy with the position of those, then I would just put a few drops of glue just inside the bottom edge. This is the basting glue, just inside the bottom edge of my petal or inside the edge of the circle, and just position them down. With basting glue, once you've got them in position, then you just need to press it with the iron, and that will hold it firm for you. So this is my flower then. The petals are all glued to the circle, and you should be able to see just how I've got them really positioned so that they're inside the edge of the circle there. and I've lined them up so that there's, you know, same distance between them, but they're well secured because I've used the basting glue and attached them. They'll stay that way until I stitch them down. You know, if I decided I wasn't happy, I can still peel that off and rearrange them if need be. But like I said, it's still not too late to choose which background fabric we put it on. We could position it on there, and by the time we add a few leaves, you know, it would still work quite well. I think what I'm going to do with it though is still put it on this one that I chose, because I think it stands out nicely on that. And at this point I haven't decided how many of those leaves, whether I'm going to use a couple of bunches. I did do 5, so you know, I can work it out. You know, as we mentioned earlier, there are a couple of different layouts. So what we need to do though, before we can stitch it onto that background fabric, what you'll notice is that the basket, you know, has got a square base, so it's got boxed corners. So we need to take that into consideration. And to do that, I'm going to put both my pieces of fabric together. And it's a 1.5 inch square for the boxed corners, so I'll just lay my ruler on there, 1.5 inches, and with my air erasable pen I'm just going to mark that line. And you'll need to do this for both the lining and the outside edge pieces. So 1.5 inch square, and then we're going to cut that out. Okay, so I'll put that one aside for the moment, because this is the one we're going to be working on or attaching our flower to. So what I need to take into consideration then before I position my flower, and you'll work out which way around you want it to go depending on the pattern, but we need to remember that we don't want anything to come beyond this line here, because that, in fact, 1/4 inch above that, because that's where our basket's going to turn underneath. So, you know, whatever you put up beyond that line will be underneath, so just bear that in mind. The other thing that we're going to be considering is whereabouts things are at the top. So by the time we finish our basket and turn that over, you know, we don't want too much of it to be hidden underneath as well. So we just will keep that in mind. And to that end, we will leave ourselves 1 3/4 inches from the top. Leaving enough for the, which is basically there. So that's the space that we've got then to, you know, have our flower without knowing that, or knowing that anything up above that will end up underneath the little band at the top. Anything below that will end up going underneath. So position your flower then in a way that you would like him to be, and determine what you want to do with your leaves then. You know, whether you're wanting them together or separate, or whether you'd like, you know, to have one in between each of the petals. Because as I said, we've given you 5, so you've got a choice there. You choose. Once you've got that done, we'll just put a little bit of basting glue on the flower and the leaves in the order that you'd like them to go. When you put your basting glue on your leaves, make sure you avoid getting up near that tail, because once it's pressed down, it will be hard to get that tail underneath. So when you put your basting glue on, just do it around this top edge, so that when you're stitching your tail down, tail underneath, you'll be able to lift up the bottom to stick your tail under. When you stitch, then you're going to stitch it with that same blind applique stitch that we used to put the two circles together. And again, you'll go round the outside edge, picking up your big circle as you go. There you go. So with I've got all of this stitched down now, and I've just left this little leaf to show you how I deal with that. But what I do when I've got the leaf down, as I said, don't put glue underneath that tail section, because you're going to need to be able to tuck it in. What I do is start stitching on the side opposite to where the tail sticks out. So this tail's sticking out on that side, which is my left side. I've started stitching on the opposite side, so the right side, and I've stitched all the way around, and I'm almost around to that tail. And what I do then is a combination of using my needle to tuck it in underneath, and using my fingernail. I've got a, well, usually I have a decent thumbnail. It's not so good at the moment, but I do make sure that everything is tucked in underneath there. And again, it's the same stitch that we were doing earlier on when we were putting our circles around. So up on the side of our leaf, through the side and down on the outside. When you get up to that point, then just put a few extra stitches on that point to make sure that everything is enclosed. You might need to put a little bit of pressure on it as you're stitching to make sure it all stays well tucked under. So once you've got all of that one stitched, the next step then is to make your other flower and pop it onto your background fabric. And you'll do that in exactly the same way as you did this first one, but you might like to choose a different layout for your petals and your leaves, so that, yeah, you might like a bit of variety like this one, or you might like to do them the same on both sides. Completely up to you. This is where you use your own creativity, and I'm sure you'll come up with different ideas to the ones I've got. This is just a starting point for you. So once we've finished that, then we'll be ready to go on and start making the basket. We haven't finished our hand stitching though. We've still got some embroidery to do, but we'll leave that for the next video. So yeah, I'll leave you with this one then. Stay tuned for part 2, and we'll turn it into a basket.